Virologist there. Okay. Yep.
Okay, it's going. Okay, perfect. So I'll jump right into my questions then. Thank you again for joining me. Super excited to have you on. Um, so basically, I want to just start by asking a couple questions about like the vaccines that we currently have available. Um, Really, like I wanted to know why you think people, um, or at least like why the medical community, especially in certain governments, were so hesitant about the AstraZeneca and Johnson vaccines, like as they relate to the clots that people were having.
Mhm.
Because at least from what I saw, it seemed like the number of people who experienced blood clots was not that many
Yeah.
of the total population. So I
Yeah.
was just wondering, like, what your thoughts were.
Well, I think, they were, you always have to exercise extra levels of caution anytime you bring in a new vaccine or anything like that, any kind of medical intervention. And so it's only natural that when you go from, basically, when you start from, especially a new vaccine, this is something we didn't have a vaccine. So it had to go very quickly through the phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials to get approval. Um, all of those steps were done in the right amount of time and following the right precautions and the right analyses, of course. But of course, it was kind of all done in this kind of backdrop of having to go as quickly as possible in urgency. And so, no matter what, when you get to a phase 3 trial, which usually involves around 30,000 people or tens of thousands, the next step is that you make it available to the general population, and then it goes into potentially millions, and only then do you actually see any kind of adverse or side effects or any kind of effects that can occur in the more rare instances where you're really talking about 1 in a million case chances. And so I think as soon as the slightest things were being observed in the medical community, you would have to make that case, make the point, alert all of the other, um, what do you call it, um, public health systems around the world to have a look at that as well. And so I think it's in that kind of ultra cautious backdrop that these were first being noticed. Um, and of course, these are in these cases, these are very, very rare instances. It's also more common, I think, to that you would see troubles in clotting, even with actual COVID itself. On the other hand, they were
Right. Yeah.
occurring in healthy young individuals where you normally don't see it, and it wasn't the standard type of clot. So I think there was reason for bringing this up, and it seemed to be occurring, or seems to be occurring within the context of these kinds of vaccines. So I think it's only
Yeah.
fair that all of this is being looked at and has to be looked at. Now it's hard then to relativize that and have people understand that this is still super rare compared to the risk of getting COVID and what might happen if you get COVID, which is much
Uh,
worse in most cases. But you have to
yeah.
ultimately leave that to the person to understand and then make a decision based on that understanding, which is difficult to do.
Yeah, because I think now there's like some concern that, well, first of all, I guess there's some. At least I know in the U.S., there were a lot of people who were scheduled to get the Johnson vaccine, and those appointments got pulled really abruptly. But now that the Johnson is being offered again, but a lot of people are very hesitant now to get that.
Mhm.
Because I think some people I think there seems to be a lot of like uncertainty over whether that was the like right move to make. Um,
Mhm.
But it sounds like it sounds like you think that like that was the right move to make, and
I
now we can proceed with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it always comes down to weighing the benefits and costs and the risks and all that. And I think even that with every different virologist or medical professional you speak to, they will also have a different opinion. And so ultimately,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
you know, I I respect the decision of other people to decide what they want to do with themselves and ultimately whether they want to protect themselves or not. But I also believe you should be taking a vaccine for the benefit of your community and not just yourself, right? So I you have to just I think you have to make the answer the question yourself of how much risk you're willing to take for the benefit. And ultimately I am knowledgeable enough in the vaccines that there are no risks, in my opinion. Right? It's so minuscule that
Yeah.
isn't there. I think that the yes, I think that at that time they had to slow down or halt the the vaccination program because we have been going as fast as possible to get vaccines out of urgency. And so even though halting it, it turns out the risk wasn't as great. It was exactly what we imagined to be quite rare. Imagine if it were different, right?
Yeah. Right.
Only now can we say, well, we shouldn't perhaps have halted it because now people are more hesitant to take it. But had it actually been something much worse, then that no one would take any vaccine at that point.
Right. Yeah.
Possible to vaccinate anyone from that point onward, no matter where that vaccine came from. So I think it's like it's a learning curve, and it's something that now it's going to be even more difficult to have the public understand that we weren't quite sure of how safe or risky it was, and now we confirm indeed it wasn't that risky. But yeah, how do you get the message across? Now, please trust us from here on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So
No, and then it trend. So go ahead.
no, it's just that it's like it probably has slowed and hampered things more, but we still must go on with the vaccination protocols and try to convince more and more people to join in.
Yeah, and actually, so on that same thread, with at least let's say talking about the U.S., because I know the U.S.'s vaccination program is further along than most countries. When do you think like a kind of return to normalcy would happen? Um, like in the U.S., and then we can talk about like in France and like other places.
Well, again, I'm probably not the expert for this, in terms of public health, etc. But we can hope that the normalcy will happen once whatever we think herd immunity or close to herd immunity will be, which is numbers around 70%, 80% is what's been shown. I think Israel will help us know what that number will need to be because they've done the best at covering their population. And I think as soon as we've reached that point, then that's when we can assume maximum protection will occur and that the virus will still circulate, but will be on its way out.
Okay, yeah, and then I know that you're an expert with RNA viruses. So how can like how concerned are you about the variants of COVID and how it could like prolong the pandemic and the public health measures that we have to take?
Yeah, I think I'm not I'm not as concerned of the variants as much as perhaps the overall scientific community has been because they have discovered variants for the first time through COVID and through this pandemic. Uh, it's a rather fascinating time scientifically because it's the only time we have been able to actually sequence in real time and observe the emergence of variants as they are happening and not in retrospect. For every other
Oh, okay.
for every other world pandemic or very large epidemic that's gone through many different countries that I've studied, this emergence of variants has also happened. It's only that we only caught the last one, and we only know at the end what won. We didn't see the battle of variants happening in the beginning that led to that. An example,
Oh, interesting.
if we look at the emergence of chikungunya virus, which happened, there were two large worldwide or multi-continent epidemics that occurred since year 2000. There's Zika virus, which came through. There is Ebola virus, which went through many countries in Africa. And in all those situations, we actually have a little bit of anecdotal evidence that the genotype or the strain, the virus at the end that we sequenced is different from the one that was circulating many years before. And we have some data that suggests that those changes have allowed that virus to better infect a host, whether it be the vector that carries it or maybe the human, and helps transmission. The thing is, we don't have every week intervals during all of that. We don't have the sequences to see this kind of emergence and battle of variants that we are seeing right now in real time with the coronavirus. So
Right.
in the end, probably what will happen is that one of them will eventually emerge and be the one that then continues and eventually disappears. It will not be endless because there are only, we're seeing it, there's only a few different ways that this thing can get better at what it's doing. And so the same mutations seem to appear around the world on different lineages, but it tends
Yeah.
to be the same thing. Because even though there's thousands of nucleotides that can change, a virus only has a couple of ways to get better at what it's doing, starting from where it started. So either, now the question that remains to be answered is, so with these variants, in the end, will there be one that pretty much dominates and then disappears? And we won't see coronavirus again, at least this one? Or will it continue to kind of evolve gently, chasing or being chased by our own immune system and vaccines into something more like influenza, which is a yearly changing virus that has to be, and for which the vaccine also has to be updated. And maybe that can last a longer time, and it's only every decade or so that will disappear and then be replaced by an entirely new virus from the same family. Those are the
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, speaking of the flu, some people have said that COVID could become like a shot you have to take every year with the flu. Is that something that you see happening?
Well, so I mean, so far that seems to be what we're heading towards. We already it looks like we need a couple of shots just to get the immunity for the vaccine to last long enough to get us to next year. Now with flu, there's two things. There's that flu itself evolves or is changing and is escaping potentially the immune response from the previous year. And so it keeps changing. We have to update the vaccine to keep up with that. But it's also that for the flu vaccine itself, generally the immunity that it will induce doesn't last much longer than a year or a couple of years anyway, or at least to high enough levels that it's really well protected. So it requires a booster. So
That's because the flu will like vary, right? That's because like it'll change enough.
So on the one hand, there is that the flu will vary and will change so that our antibodies will no longer work as well against it. And generally we see, if I recall from this, I haven't worked in flu for a while, but if I recall, it's, maybe an antibody against your given strain now will ultimately no longer work against the flu that has changed by within 5 years from now. But there's that. But there's also that the vaccine itself induces immunity that doesn't last forever compared to other certain vaccines for other viruses, for example. So with the vaccines we have now for coronavirus, it seems that these vaccines do not induce a long lasting immunity. And we probably will have to get a booster anyway, X number of months or years from now to reactivate the immunity. But then what we don't know is, will the virus itself also evolve and mutate to no longer be recognized by those antibodies? And so we would have to update it as well. There's two reasons for which we might have to update and do get vaccinated more than once. Compared to, let's say, something like poliovirus, which you can be vaccinated for once for your entire life if it's the
Yeah.
attenuated vaccine, and your antibodies will always recognize it because that virus doesn't change. And
Okay. And then actually, so just for people who like don't know as much about like specific viruses, what actually is it in like the Zika virus compared to COVID that that like has the vaccines for Zika work for it just once? Or sorry, you said
polio, polio,
yeah,
polio virus.
polio. So like what is it about the polio virus versus COVID that prevents polio from changing to evade like the vaccines?
So in that case, I mean, it's you'd have to answer this question virus by virus, vaccine by vaccine, because they're all different. They're all different combinations. But in this particular case, polio virus is completely well adapted. It's been perfectly adapted to humans. It is strictly human, so to speak. It's a virus that belongs to us. It's been with us for thousands of years, but it's a proteinaceous virus. It's only made of proteins. It's ultimately structurally, it's very rigid, and it has to, the way its actual structure has to be a certain way and cannot vary. So our immune response will recognize part of that structure, which is essential to it being able to infect our cells, and it just can't change that in many other ways without messing up the rest of the structure of the virus and falling apart. So it just happens to be its weakness is that it can't change that. Whereas the immune response that is directed towards coronavirus is not against a protein that is so rigid in its structure and how it fits with other proteins. And so ultimately there's a little more flexibility there where that virus can change how it looks to evade the immune response. That's in this particular case, right? But it's also the kind of vaccine. For the polio, I was referring to a live attenuated vaccine that we used to give. We don't even give this anymore, but we used to give a sugar cube basically, and it was a live virus. So it actually was, no longer caused the disease, but it
Right.
replicated in us. And when you have a live replicating vaccine, the immune response is much, much stronger. And it's more long lasting because it's seeing an actual real infection. Whereas for the coronavirus vaccines, it's just a protein, for example. And so it's not
Right.
going to necessarily give a long lasting immune response.
So then, yeah, because I think like also like people are really excited by like the mRNA vaccines with COVID because like you said like for like the Moderna and Pfizer specifically like it's not a live the vaccine doesn't give you a live version of COVID, right? It's just the protein.
Yeah.
Do you foresee like what extent do you foresee the mRNA technology being used for different viruses
I think
like in
now
the
that
future?
now that the door is open, this really will potentially open the door to many, many more vaccines that we previously couldn't have. So for until now, I mean, many of the vaccines were either live attenuated vaccines, which are very difficult to generate and to be sure that they are safe and that they will not revert to the actual pathogenic form, or they were basically vaccines where you have to grow the virus. So you have to be able to grow it and then kill it and treating it with whatever detergents, etc., to break it into pieces and purify it. But it required the ability to grow the whole virus, which for many viruses, we can't do that even. We don't have the right conditions or the right cells with which to grow it, and so it limits the possibility of going any further to develop vaccines. Here now, we have mRNA where we can at least get a sequence of one of the proteins of the virus that we know will likely be the target of the immune response, and we can put it into an RNA without having to grow the virus. So potentially it opens the door to create vaccines for viruses for which we have zero vaccines up to now.
Such as what though? Like what, like other, like,
Well, I mean, a lot of
viruses?
the, for a lot of, I work a lot on mosquito-borne viruses. Most of those have no vaccines available. They're still either in clinical trials or even preclinical development. And so for anything like, right now there isn't actually a chikungunya virus or a dengue virus, a Zika virus, West Nile virus. Those do not have vaccines currently. Um, the mRNA, at least it allows this whole new technology to try to develop vaccines for these. It's not necessarily going to work, but it really creates the opportunity, or it really widens, let's say, the repertoire of what we can use to try to make these vaccines.
Yeah, because I think for this is I think like I was reading that the malaria virus is more of like a bacteria that the mosquito injects into someone. Um, could mRNA technology be used for like that virus, for example,
Well, yeah.
or
So
for that sickness?
so
Or
you brought in every possible microbe all in one. So the malaria,
okay,
malaria is a parasite, and it's not a virus, and it's not a bacteria either. So it's actually, ultimately the answer could be RNA vaccines could work against any sort of anything for which we need to induce an immune response. Malaria, I mean, parasites and bacteria are way out of my world. I don't think of
oh
them.
okay,
Right, so it is, viruses, bacteria, parasites, etc. But I mean, it doesn't really matter, because your question is asking, can mRNA vaccines or therapeutics treat things other than the coronavirus or other viruses? And the answer is probably yes, because it is a way to express within a human the protein target of a microbe or even a cancer, right? So the mRNA technology was far more advanced in terms of development for clinical trials for humans in the context of cancer. And it happens that COVID, when it came, kind of opened the door, the rush to have to find something. And the whole mRNA technology had matured over the last 30 years to the point where it was now poised and ready to give it a try. So I think it's the answer being it does work for this RNA virus, means that it will likely work for many other viruses or other therapies that need to induce an immune response.
which you mentioned cancer there. So do you think mRNA technology could be used as like a potential cure for cancer, which I know has been researched a lot,
It'll definitely
like
be
over.
it'll definitely be used for treatments for cancers, because in many cancers, these cancer cells, tumor cells, will express a certain antigen that is either specific to that cell or hyper expressed in that cell. And so there could be a way to target that specifically by inducing an immune response against that kind of, again, it's a protein that's saying, I am not the normal human protein, the way, whether it comes from a virus or from a tumor cell, then it'll be targeted by the immune response. So a lot of the development for mRNA vaccines since the late 1990s has been in as in targeting tumors, simply because the need for it was greater there, and the funding, the money, the market for finding these things was much greater than for many of the viruses for which we either already had treatments and vaccines, or there simply wasn't an existing market to try to develop it, right? So my PhD was done in 1997 on RNA vaccine approaches, at a time when it was thought it was completely ridiculous to imagine using RNA. And I was just comparing it to plasmid DNA, which was the new thing at the time, the whole gene immunization with DNA. But at the time, it was considered cute and weird, but never feasible, not at all. and then it required another 20 years to figure out how to stabilize RNA and to find a way to be able to actually deliver it properly.
Yeah, well, sounds like you proved them all wrong.
Oh yeah.
Very much.
Well, I at least, I mean, at least at the time we thought it could actually work, but it required uh, harder working teams and people to actually find the way how to make it work. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, they must like look back and go, wow, we were so wrong
I
about
was just,
this.
you know, I was just, it feels great to have been a tiny little part of it way back when really it was an upstream idea of like, can you imagine if this would work? So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, no, and I mean, in science, that seems to be how a lot of like bold ideas start. In like any field, like even with like Einstein's theories of relativity, or like a lot of things seem wild and crazy when they first come out, and then
Well,
you
yeah,
get more research and
you really realize how much time it takes. So even with the RNA vaccines, when in the general media or even in the scientific world that outside of maybe molecular biology, you know, it's like this new thing, how quickly it came, right? The vaccine has, and the from RNA to vaccine. And it was like, well, in reality, it's not that new, right? When people were afraid of like, can we inject this? How do we know it's safe? It's like, well, it is 30 years of research.
yeah.
When we first put mRNA in a mouse, it was 1993 where we then saw it work.
Oh,
1993 is the very first time we knew it could probably, maybe in some far Star Trek future work. And that's, I recall thinking that, you know. And so it's first of all, I love that it ultimately, well, it isn't an entire lifetime. It's 20 to 30 years that I've been able to see it happen. But it also isn't just one or two people, because this is hundreds and thousands of different scientists working in different labs at little chipping away at the topic until finally it reaches the end, right? And in this case, there were two separate things. There was the whole RNA, using RNA to express proteins, and also all the chemists that were, how do we make RNA stable enough to be able to be administered and not get degraded and chopped up before it even gets there.
yeah. Well, no, I think so. I think like even though like the technology, I guess like I didn't know it'd been around for that long, but even though it's been around since the 90s, I think people were like kind of like concerned almost, because it seemed like the way the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines got approved, they were approved in like less than like a year, right? But most like I remember reading like news articles early in the pandemic, like in April 2020 ish time, and they were saying like, oh, we're not going to have a vaccine until like 2024. Like all of these trials would take a long time. Um, so do you think like this approval process for the COVID vaccines could speed up the approval for different kinds of vaccines?
Well, so I think, you know, one thing that this did show us, and it it showed how a lot of that whole approval process is much of it is very bureaucratic, and it's just the time it takes when you're not in a hurry and you have 100 or 1,000 other things that need approval on their way to clinical trials, etc. Everything is not overlapped. It's all done sequentially, and you wait for it to be done and packaged and sent to another office, etc. So really, it's like a lot of those 20 years of wait is probably kind of bureaucratic and just the regular slower measures. Um,
That's so crazy though that
but,
it's
but
20 years to one.
well, it's
Like,
also, it's not all just that. It's that a lot of the front work had already been done as well. You know, a lot of the mRNA stuff, they were already moving towards preclinical trials or clinical trials for other things like the cancer treatments, etc. So there was, I imagine there were a lot of things already put in place. And so when it came to actually doing the trials, it appeared they were rushed in the sense that there was no time to waste. So let's just, you know, do it and do it rather than all, you know, wait for periods of times between trials. Set them up so they're running in parallel, for instance, and then they're being immediately analyzed. So there was that. But that all of the work required, they didn't skip anything. So the clinical trials were completed as they were to be completed, and it involved all the regular necessary steps. But it does show how quickly, when you really, really have to, we can respond. Now, the issue is there are now hundreds of other diseases that require attention, and we can't force the entire planet to stop and then focus on that disease as well, or we'll just run out of time, I guess, in the same sense. But
Actually, so that brings, or sorry, go ahead.
well, but I think we do have to at least learn maybe to optimize these procedures, which may have become too bureaucratic or too, I don't know, too focused in one thing or another. I think after COVID, there'll be a lot of reflection to try to see where did we go right, where did we go wrong, and what can we learn about our medical systems and our scientific systems, etc., to make it better in the next time.
Yeah, actually, so that brings me to another question I had. So, what do you? So I know you said like there's like hundreds of other diseases and viruses that need our attention. What do you think is the most dangerous virus that could cause another, could cause a pandemic like this?
Oh, I can't. It's too soon to ask me that question right now.
Oh,
Yeah, my, I could not even stomach trying to imagine that.
but if you could name one, like in your opinion, you're looking at all the viruses, so like Zika.
I know. I refuse. I refuse.
Okay.
I refuse after this whole pandemic on my shoulders. I am exhausted. I refuse to even believe there is another virus. You've got to,
Okay.
you have got to wait until I'm at least on vacation on a beach for a couple of
Okay.
weeks before
Okay.
we discuss the next possible virus.
Okay. I'll wait till you're nice. You're on vacation. You're hanging out on the beach,
Yeah,
beaches of France, and I'll be like,
because
Marco, can you tell me which one is next?
you know, I tell everybody, like anybody who knows me, all my friends, there was that movie Contagion, which was really
Yeah.
excellent, and there was never a movie that wasn't better, more properly done, that kind of made us really see what a true pandemic could be from the kind of almost correct, right, scientifically correct. Just the time scale was rushed, but I used to watch that over and over. I've probably seen that over 50 times. It's my favorite movie ever. I cry throughout it, right? So
Oh,
I mean, it definitely has more of an emotional tug than it should, and most people wouldn't see this movie that way at all. But I would watch it all the time, right? And it's like right at the end when she figures out the vaccine and she's right in front of the monkey that has been saved from the vaccine. That's when I break into tears and I'm crying in the corner. But so that was my favorite movie, and it's just to say that since COVID happened, I'm good. I don't need to watch that again.
yeah. Yeah. No, I think actually the thing is like, so that movie, people watched that in like early pandemic because we didn't know how serious this was, right? And in Contagion, the virus, if I remember correctly, I guess it sounds like you've watched it a lot, you know, but the virus in Contagion like kills people in like 3 or 4 days, right? Like it's a lot more serious.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
it's like a very, you know, that virus was, it's like if you took all of the correct but bad parts of different pandemics and united them, it kind of gives you this. But it would have been, I mean, it was based a lot on SARS and Nipah virus, and it's just kind of bringing those two together and imagining that the transmission would be quicker and easier perhaps. But it gives a real, you know, a real idea, and if we rewatch it now, we would realize actually a lot of it, the fear of you know, the social distancing, and then the fear, and then as the vaccine rollout is coming, not everybody gets vaccinated. It's everything is pretty much on point. But again,
yeah, no,
you know, if we have to talk about another, no, I just can't talk about any virus. I could say
yeah,
that, you know, the bad ones are still the bad ones. The viruses that are like Ebola are clearly a big thing to look out for. The Nipah viruses, are bad. Lisa fever virus is another bad virus that's out there. For my own mosquito-borne viruses, we are looking at what is the next one to come out of the jungle, and one of them is Mayaro virus, which is a cousin of chikungunya. It's in the Amazon forest, and there are more and more cases of spillover where some people in the Amazon region will be infected, and it's a matter of time, possibly, before that virus will jump into an urban mosquito and start to create more, human mosquito infections.
Okay. See, so there we go. So I got some
Yeah, like just not, yeah.
names of viruses.
Yeah, I gave you a couple of names. I won't speculate which one is bad. I just can't right now.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. And then I wanted to ask you too. So speaking of spillover from like animal to human, I think the prevalent theory about where COVID came from early in the pandemic was it was a bat in China, in Wuhan. But recently there's been some speculation that there's a level 4 lab in Wuhan that deals a lot with viruses. And people think that maybe COVID came from a lab leak as opposed to a animal spillover. Do you like know anything about this or think like
Yeah,
one or the other?
yeah, I don't know because I haven't, I don't know. I don't even know how necessarily we could know if there was an accident of that type. I don't, those are very unlikely, and I would not, it's not what, at least it's the idea of was it created in a lab. I think we've moved that aside and it's unlikely. Was it an accidental lab infection? I don't think so. There is the level of protection when you're working at not even level 4, just the level 3 virus. The amount of protection involved and the safety procedures that are required makes it very, very unlikely for that to occur. But I don't know. Has it occurred in the past? Yes. There's the 1977 flu, which was the return of H1N1, was a case of infection that happened in a lab and eventually came back into the human population. But it's
which lab was that?
I don't know the specific lab. It was a lab in Russia. Yeah.
Okay.
But
yeah, because sorry, go ahead.
I mean, well, so the possibility is there, but the likelihood of a virus emerging from nature is thousands of times higher than it emerging or accidentally coming out of a lab, right? And it's like the number of spillover events are for the fact are occurring all the time. If we as virologists have found it, it means that we came close enough to it, not for the first time. There must be other times where humans are coming into contact with these viruses. Not every time that a virus jumps over by accident to a human does it catch, right? So I think that, well, this is something that we need to understand better, and we don't know, is that the ecology of viral emergence. Because the virus that is not meant to be in humans is not well adapted to humans. So how many times does the interaction, the accidental bite or whatever occur, and just the virus tries to grow but can't in the human, and so doesn't grow enough to spread? So that likely is happening more often than we imagined. And I think it's the thing we do need to understand. And where is it happening?
Because I know that like COVID is at least from what I've read, it seems like it's very well adapted to humans. So if it if it came from, if it was like a species spillover event, how do you think it became so well how do you think it adapted so well to humans?
Yeah, I don't know if we can say that. Well, I think it's well adapted to many different hosts. There's some viruses that just have an extremely wide host range to begin with, because the fact it seems to be it seems to be adapting more to humans, right? If we consider the new variants to be improving its ability to transmit among humans. But it also is able to infect minks or is able to infect other mammals and other animals, right? So we already know that,
Dogs too, right?
right, right. And so we and
Yeah.
we know from the coronaviruses, the different ones, that they have a quite a wide host range. So I wouldn't say that it was already, it's not that it was specifically adapted to humans, it's that it was already able to infect many different animals. Some, and this is different from other viruses, that there's some viruses that are very, very specific. And that depends also on how they infect the cell. What is the receptor they use to get it? Is that receptor only in humans, or is it in all animals or all living things?
And then like I guess like in the same thread, so like what would you consider like definitive evidence that that COVID was like a spillover? Like is there like a specific thing where like you're like, oh, we found this virus in like this animal and this animal, so clearly it must have followed this path?
Well, so yeah, I think it's very difficult to have definitive evidence of spillover because we don't even know all of the animals that are out there, right? It's like for most viruses that I work with, which tend to be these emerging viruses that have somehow jumped species, we don't really know what the reservoir is. You know, if I'm thinking even of many of the things like chikungunya virus, Mayaro virus, etc., we don't know. We assume that the reservoir where it exists is either a non-human primate or a rodent, a mammal of some kind in the tropical forests or jungles. Without knowing that, we can't really get the direct evidence because we can't sample the viruses from the mosquito through X number of mammals in the forest to us, right? So we might find one, but it might not be the true line. It might also be an accidental dead end host the way we were initially. And without knowing all of the species that are out there, it's almost impossible to be completely sure. And oftentimes we just see an intermediate host that is somewhat close to us, often a domesticated animal or a wild animal that is somehow being traded in in the animal trade, etc. But really the one that is out there in the forest, who knows?
Okay, yeah, because I guess the closest one people have thought is like a bat, right? So you're saying like it may have come from a couple other species back and then reached the bat and then gotten to us.
Yeah, or
So
from the bat to us, there was some question of pangolin or other other kinds of animals, and for even for things like the mosquito viruses that I work on, we know we know perfectly well where chikungunya virus is circulating among humans and which two species of urban mosquito are involved in this urban cycle, the one that catches us and causes our outbreaks. But when it actually comes from the forest, there we don't know exactly which species of mosquitoes, and there's many of them that could be potentially carrying the virus. And so that gets much more complicated because suddenly you don't know how many different mosquito species and how many different hosts, because each mosquito preferentially feeds off different hosts. And what does that look like? Is it just a 1-2 combination, or is it a bigger and stranger network? And so we don't know that. And ideally, if we did know it, we would be able to identify what is the interaction, the accidental interaction that occurs between us and them that needs to be avoided.
right, yeah. And then actually, so just like a more general question too, just because I was thinking about this the other day. What do you think like the origin of viruses in general is? Because viruses are not, I think there's debate among people in biology whether they're living completely or not, how different they are from animals and that they require a host where animals don't. So
So
where do you think, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There's the thing of where did they come from, in a sense of also, were they the predecessors of all the other things, or did they lose some functions and come from other things? And I actually don't know, and I don't have much of an opinion on it. But and then the question is, are they living or not? Which again is, for me, is irrelevant. And it's funny because it might even be generational. Well, certainly when I learned it, they were not alive, because to be alive, you had to be able to replicate, or replicate yourself, or mate and create progeny yourself. And the virus couldn't. It absolutely needs something else to allow it to multiply. Um, but uh, overall, does it really matter? I mean, for me,
Yeah.
it's just it's a definition that makes humans feel more comfortable with whatever they need to accept. But the virus will do it either way. It'll continue to replicate. I think it's just the lines are too blurred in biology to be able to separate things in that way, in what is alive and what is not alive, in what is one species and another. So, viruses, I think, are just fascinating, because they are this minimal piece of information that allows itself to spread, but on its own, it's inert. And then if we go a step further, there's even prions, right, which are proteins that somehow can become now infectious and cause change. And those are not even, there's no genetic material there. So who knows where to draw the line.
Yeah, well, no, because I just ask because I think like there's some people who have thought that like if we can understand how to almost like create a virus, like there's been tests to, I know there's been research and like figuring out how life began and
Mm,
how if there's a way to create like a DNA strand
yeah.
and like could we actually just create life in a lab from basically like things that like aren't alive? If there's a way we can understand like
Yeah.
where viruses came from, can we? Yeah.
And I think so for RNA viruses, which are the simplest of viruses as well, I think there's that interesting point of, if you take an RNA virus, it's just a little bit of RNA that replicates thanks to taking proteins from the cell, and then it encodes for basically its genome and its shell to propagate. But then there's viroids, which don't even have the shell. It's literally just RNA that replicates, right? And so that's when you start to get to then at the very origins of life, or organisms. We imagine in the primordial soup, it was these sort of self-assembling RNA structures that then found a way to kind of cut themselves or replicate and make more of themselves. And then you get very close to, well, that's just one step away from virus, right? So it comes to the question of, are they at the origin? So maybe. I mean, I haven't thought a lot about it. I imagine yes, probably in the very early forms, they looked like what today's RNA viruses look like, but certainly the ones that we have today have nothing to do with what was around before. Because then there's a whole exchange of genetic material back and forth that continues throughout time between organisms.
Is there a way to trace like the evolution of viruses similar to like human beings? Is there evidence for like simpler versions of viruses like thousands and thousands of years ago, and like now they've become different?
Well, we can't. I mean, we don't have a lot. We can't go very far back and actually have true examples of viruses, especially RNA, because that doesn't even live much longer than a few seconds out of, in the environment. But the same techniques used to, the phylogenetic and molecular clock techniques used to try to piece back genetically the DNA-based organisms work for the viruses themselves. So we can see that for all of the viruses, these do break down more or less into families, genera, etc., the way the rest of taxonomy does. So it suggests that they do have common ancestors that we can imagine go back X number of years, but it all becomes much blurrier because viruses also have there's a lot of evidence of genetic exchange and recombination and things that happen that make those phylogenetic trees not as convincing when you start to try to get too far back.
And those gene exchanges and changes all happen in hosts, right? Like there's no interaction of, because I guess like in order for the virus to change, it has to interact with the host somehow, and then like make a mistake or like have like essentially like all the changes a virus has to happen within a host,
Yeah,
right? Like that's
so the virus, unlike all the other things like bacteria or bigger, is that they absolutely need to copy themselves and to be active. They need the host. They need to be in a host because most of the proteins that are required for replication and translating and making proteins, all of that do not exist in the virus. And so it has to hijack the host machinery and just have the host, in addition to doing what it's doing, make things required by the virus.
how do you think like this might be a silly question, but how do you think viruses have survived for so long? Because it seems like if they need a host to survive, then at least like at least one like copy of a virus has to exist in the host at all times for it to maintain itself. Because if at any time a virus is not in the host, then it would die off. Correct.
Yeah.
So they always have to have.
Well, they always need to be in a host, either replicating or chronic in some form or another. And that's a good philosophical question. Of I suppose the other way of asking is how many viruses haven't made it and have disappeared over time because of that exact reason. There just hasn't been enough. There haven't been enough hosts to maintain them. It all depends also on what is the lifestyle that ultimately each virus has chosen. I'm doing a lot of personification here, but it's true.
Yes.
Like, you know, there are some viruses that rather than go fast and furious and replicate and get out, but it needs to be very close to another host in the time, you know, in the time that one sneezes, or it can be something more like a sexually transmitted persistent infection where you're not necessarily going to come in contact with other hosts that often, but you're sticking around in the host long enough for that to occur, right? So it's
Right.
viruses are ultimately challenged with that, and the ones that win are the ones that over time have managed to evolve and the mechanisms or the lifestyles required to survive. But if a host changes, or you know, in anything, if the host changes in distribution, in some kind of behavior method, it can alter dramatically the the niche in which the virus exists, and that might be the downfall of the virus, but it might open a new niche for other viruses.
Right. Yeah. And then I think one of my final questions too was so I know you've been working in the field for a long time, and I think on YouTube I saw some videos where you talked about your personal drive, um, like um, your kind of like your drive to go into the lab every day and to work hard on viruses. And I know now during COVID, obviously now it's like like now, um, like obviously like it's you know like the motivation to work is clearly there because there's a pandemic. But what would be your advice to younger people trying to get into not just the field, not just like getting into virus research, but other fields of research when their expertise is not needed as like as much as like yours is now, for example?
Well, you'll never know whether your expertise will be needed to much of an extent, but it's it's certainly never why anyone goes into a research or academic type of position, there's ultimately for most of the academics or researchers that I've encountered, the one thing driving them is this passionate, obsessive need to understand this one tiny thing more than anything else. And then the motivation might be different for others, and it also depends on what field you are in. But the drive, for whatever reason, is that this little thing seems to be the one thing you are really naturally good at feeling out and understanding. And for me, for a long time, I didn't see myself doing basic research in molecular virology because I didn't quite find the niche that fit with me until I started studying viruses as these kind of dynamic populations. And then suddenly I felt this is the one thing where it feels so natural to me that I don't have to think very hard to try to even see it in my head, what I'm trying to study. And if someone is lucky enough to find that, then that's where you just focus your whole concentration. And then who knows, it might or it may never be so relevant that the rest of the world pays attention to you. But it's essential
Right.
that in the world we keep funding all of these people focused on these tiny things, because sometimes one out of every 7,000 of them we might need for a specific problem, right? So that's been my case. And then again, I may have, maybe it's the interviews I spoke with before, but for me, it was the motivation ultimately for specifically studying viruses has been because I was so traumatically affected by the HIV epidemic that was coming out in the 80s. And I was still an impressionable child when I was seeing it on TV. But it really scared me, and it really kind of imprinted and stuck there. That I just remember seeing, I don't understand what that is, but it seems to be killing a lot of people and no one wants to help them. I remember seeing that. And just that unfairness, I just thought if ever I could figure out how to fight that disease, I want to do it. And that stuck with me. So for me, I've always needed or hoped that whatever I was studying in virology had some sort of relevance to helping people, even though ultimately I'm in a very fundamental research where anything I do won't be a vaccine in the near future.
Yeah, and I think actually there's probably a lot of youth now that have lived through this year-long pandemic and are inspired to help the world fight other viruses and go into biology and like other fields like that.
I think so. Because it's in during this pandemic is when I remembered, or when I realized that actually it was ultimately the last major, the HIV pandemic that somehow got me to remember or notice viruses, right? And probably at a time when children are just trying to make out what they want to do or what would be fun to study, right? It wasn't until years later that eventually I came back to virology, but it was the little footprint was there. And I think this pandemic, there are a lot of kids that have been affected for the first time, having to explain to them
Yeah,
to wear a mask and etc. So I'm hopeful that maybe we'll have a lot of great virologists in the next 20 years come out.
yeah, yeah. I know it seems that in the pandemic, the vaccine technology has just accelerated so much. Like as you said, like earlier, mRNA vaccines have been around or have been in development for 20 years, but it just seems like this year they've had such a huge breakthrough in terms of their like usage, obviously, I guess.
Mhm.
But yeah. Okay, so that's all the main questions I had. I think this is supposed to be half an hour, but thank you for staying
No
for an
worries.
hour. I appreciate it a lot. Um, and yeah, can you tell people where they can follow you? Like, do you have like a Twitter or like other social media?
Yeah, it's mostly Twitter. I've stopped the Facebook account, but on Twitter I am Vignuzzi Lab, all in one. And otherwise, there's my lab website, vignuzzilab.eu. But where my lab is quite active on science Twitter, and so we started our Twitter account. I don't even remember now, but more than 7 years ago. And I try to get everybody that joins my lab to start their own Twitter account, and so we have quite a good community. And within virology itself, it's quite a large community on Twitter. So if anybody is interested in these topics, that's where you'd want to go to see not only just how we talk science and we promote each other's articles and publications, but it's also a nice place where we try to celebrate science. And in my particular case, in my group, we're big on pushing diversity in STEM, in the STEM fields.